Welcome back to the news today. This is the Daily Debate. 4.5 years into the war in Syria, and the picture is only getting less and less clear by the day. Looking at just a few of the realities. Late last week, the U.S. began a program to train Syrian rebels in an effort to build a force to fight the Islamic State. The regime has slammed that as supporting terrorism. Meanwhile, in the Qalamoun Mountains near the Lebanon border, a key battle is taking place with the regime and Hezbollah fighting the al-Qaeda-linked al-Nusra Front. Here to make some sense out of all of it is retired Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Colonel Kemp, good evening.
Good evening.
Great to have you back. And Eran Singer, Mideast editor of Israel Public Radio. Good evening, Eran. I want to start with you, Eran, with that battle in Qalamoun. It's been going on for a while. We've been discussing it a lot on the news today, but it's getting more and more traction in the headlines, at least. Yeah. What is the significance of what's going on there?
This area, right across the border, near the border between Syria and Lebanon, is a major strategic point or area, and with major significance to especially for Hezbollah. They're doing the best they can in order to transfer weapons from Syria inside Lebanon. And this is one objective. The other one is to make sure that weapons will not be delivered or transferred or smuggled from Lebanon into Syria in this area. And this is why the Qalamoun Mountains are so important for them, both Hezbollah and the rebels over there. Now, what we've been witnessing in the last 4, 5, 6 days is a very intense war. This is not a fight. This is a war. This is not a battle, as Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, said last week. This is a major war going on over there because he knows, and Hezbollah know very, very well, that once they lose Qalamoun Mountains, it will be harder for them to make sure that they will be able to get over to take over new areas in this region of Syria. In other words, this is the war they're now fighting.
How big, let's stay on this for just a moment, Jabhat al-Nusra, their adversary in the Qalamoun Mountains, the regime and Hezbollah's adversary, what is the status of this group at this point in terms of strength?
It's not only Jabhat al-Nusra. We're talking about other organizations working there. It's not only what we call the al-Qaeda movements or al-Qaeda militias working in this area. This is a well-organized battle, and this is what we see. We have been witnessing in the last 4.5 years some temporary cooperations between the most radical groups and the more moderate groups.
Whenever it's convenient.
Yes, but right now what we're seeing is that Bashar al-Assad is losing more and more battles. He said himself last week that you cannot look at what's going on right now as losing the war. The war is
said you win some, you lose some.
Yes, he said even more than that. He said when you look at the war, you have tens or hundreds of battles. He said what we have in Syria is thousands of battles. What he didn't say is that we are losing most of these thousands of battles.
So Colonel Kemp, I want to look at that bigger picture. You're talking about a very organized fight in Qalamoun. If we're looking at numerous rebel groups, just last week, I think it was in Geneva, you had some 40 rebel groups coming to meet for some sort of peace talks. Are we talking about guerrilla fighting? Are we talking about sort of military style that we saw, in a different era, or what seems like a different era now?
Well, we're talking about, I think, all different manner of fighting that you can imagine, and some of these groups will come together when the time is right, when it suits them, when the agenda suits them to carry out an attack in force. Other times they'll be attacking on their own. Sometimes they'll be attacking each other. So it's a massively confused situation. And I think that what you mentioned earlier on, the American, the changed American involvement, if anything, just adds to that confusion.
Speaking about the American involvement, okay, let's look at, this is not the first time the U.S. has trained rebels in Syria. I understand there was a little bit of a criticism of failure in the past. We'll get to that in a moment. Why now? So some 90 rebels the U.S. is training in what's set to be a program to fight the Islamic State. It seems a bit small and a bit oddly timed.
I think it's probably very small indeed. Apparently they have cleared around about 3,000 to 4,000 people, security clearance, to be trained. I believe they're starting relatively small, between 100 and 400 in the first instance, but maybe building up to more. It is a drop in the ocean. And of course, it's hugely complex because they're training them and equipping them as well. It's not just training, It's also battlefield weapons, machine guns, vehicles, not tanks, not artillery, but sort of low-level battlefield weapons in the main, as I understand it. And they're training them to attack the Islamic State, but not to attack
right,
the
but
regime.
not the regime. This is a very interesting point that I want to come back to, because how that's possible is not clear at all to me. But let's join to this conversation for a moment from Istanbul, Syrian activist Aboud Dandashi. Aboud, good evening. Thanks for being with us.
Hello, good evening.
So what's your reaction to that? I'm not sure if you heard us here in the studio, but we're talking about the U.S. Beginning to train Syrian rebels. It's not clear which rebels, around 90 of them at this point in the war, 4.5 years in.
Well, events have bypassed this plan that Americans had to train a small amount of vetted Syrian rebels. By the time it takes the Americans to vet maybe 1 or 2 or even 3,000 rebels, as we can see, other groups who are not obligated to the Americans in any shape, way, or form have been taking the initiative all over Syria, and they have been setting events. They've been creating events in Syria.
We've talked in the past about training of rebels and the mistakes that were made there. If you were to advise President Barack Obama now what mistakes not to make in training Syrian rebels, what would you tell him?
Right now, the problems have a problem of credibility. Very few Syrians trust Barack Obama. Very few Syrians trust that his support will be consistent. He has been wildly inconsistent in the past. He has to prove that this time is going to be different. This time that, for a change, he's going to actually keep to his commitments, if that's what they are.
Going for a moment to the Assad regime, we mentioned earlier here in the debate that there's a lot of reports of Assad losing power. It seems to be the case, though he denies it. What do you hear in terms of Assad's power? If it's just one battle here and there, or he actually is losing power?
Well, this is a war of attrition. This has been a war of attrition for a long time. And the regime has had manpower problems for a while now. And anywhere that Hezbollah could not deploy to bolster his troops, Assad's troops have been doing very badly. Now, this recent campaign by Hezbollah in Qalamoun, which, by the way, is the 3rd campaign in Qalamoun in as many years, is very interesting in its timing. Obviously, Hezbollah prioritizes its position and situation in Qalamoun over the success of the regime in places that are further away from places that Hezbollah would put a priority on.
Aboud Dandashi, always interesting. Thanks very much for joining the conversation. You wanted to respond.
Yes, Aboud Dandashi has emphasized a very important thing here. Syrians do not trust the Obama administration anymore. And this is, and let me remind you that Mr. Obama was the one to develop the what we call leading from behind. This is what we saw in Libya and other places. And if we go back to Yemen, we should know, and it has been declared in the last few weeks by some Saudi and others officials, saying that what we have been witnessing in Yemen will also be possible in Syria. In other words, and you said that as long as the Americans don't try to hit or don't try to take over the Syrian regime strongholds in Syria, it's okay to train the rebels. This is what the Arabs are now saying. They say if the Americans don't do that, we are going to do that. And at the same time that the Americans have finally admitted that they are now training the rebels, we have been listening, or we have been witnessing some new declarations coming from the Saudis and the Turkish government saying that we are also training our forces, but their forces will not have to make this distinction between the regime forces and the others. The final destination is to make sure that Bashar al-Assad will be gone. And this is what they're now working on.
Colonel Kemp, a lot of the sort of criticism of the U.S. actions in Syria so far has been circling around the fact that there was training of certain rebel commanders, including weapons, who in the end defect to somewhere else along with their weapons, and it sort of wasn't a deep enough commitment. How do you even begin? If we're looking at what they're doing now, is it completely futile? How do you begin to train any group of people when you're talking about so many groups with changing loyalties?
No, I would assess what they're doing now as completely futile. I think it's no doubt useful for the media and useful for presentational purposes, but I don't think it's going to have any huge impact. And I am also concerned about, yes, they've cleared them, they've security vetted 3,000, 4,000 of them, but what does that really mean? How sure can you be? And somebody who may be on the right side today may be on the wrong side tomorrow, so you're going to train and equip people you cannot trust. I think the only way that the United States can can make any difference in this conflict and can hit the Islamic State is by deploying significant air forces and US ground forces.
And is it possible practically to hit the Islamic State and not the Assad regime, to make that distinction on the ground?
I think it is. I think it is. And you know, and maybe if the odd stray bomb goes towards Assad, so what? But I think there's adequate intelligence to know what targets you're hitting. And of course, that's another issue with these troops they're training, that they're saying you will get US air support if you're hitting the Islamic State. If you decide to attack Assad, you will not get US air support. It's an extremely difficult and extremely confused situation, and I really don't think this is going to be making a great deal of difference to us.
I have to say, it's hard to see, although on one hand you have Iran, for example, involved. You can't avoid superpowers getting involved in these regional crises, but it's hard to see how further involvement from the outside makes this any easier, unless perhaps it's a clear-cut, serious campaign like Colonel Kemp speaks of.
Well, it's inevitable what's going on right now. I mean, this is not a Syrian war going on right now in Syria. This is
just like in Yemen. It's not the war of Yemen, and so on.
It's much more than Yemen. Right. This is a world war going on there. I mean, you have the Russians and the Americans and
it's
the Europeans.
The new brand of world war.
Of course. And the question is, when we talk about the West, what does the West want? What does the West expect that's going to happen in Syria? I think that what we are now going to see is some new ideas saying that we don't want the regime to go away. We only want Bashar al-Assad to go away. But when you listen to the rebels, and I'm not talking about Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State. I'm talking about the Free Syrian Army, for instance, what we call the moderate rebels in Syria.
Does the Free Syrian Army still exist?
Yes,
really?
Yes, they do exist. Yes, and they say all the time, it's not only the head of Bashar al-Assad that we want. We want the entire regime to be gone. So once you have this kind of conflict between the West and what we call the moderate rebels in Syria, it will be impossible to reach a decision regarding the future of Syria.
Colonel Kemp, I want to take it a little bit outside of Syria briefly, to your experience in Afghanistan. It's not, this conflict in Syria is of course not the first time we see a host of different groups battling for power and how to deal with them and whose side the US, for example, or the United Kingdom should be on. How does this differ? Because it seems to be on an even more complex, and Afghanistan, as we see, was no easy feat.
Well, Afghanistan, of course, was, you know, you can argue about how successful the very, very long NATO and American campaign was in Afghanistan. But actually, to my way of thinking, although it was highly complex, it was incredibly simple compared to what we're seeing in Syria today. And there were obviously a number of different factors. As you know, I would agree this is a world war in Syria, and to an extent it was a world war in Afghanistan, with the US and other NATO and Western allies playing a significant role, with Iran playing a role fighting against the West in Iran as they fought against the West in Afghanistan, with Pakistan playing a most critical role. And you know, without the support of Pakistan for the Taliban campaign would not have lasted as long as it did and had the strength it did.
Do you think any lessons were learned from Afghanistan? Because we can take Afghanistan back 30, 40 years to take lessons of, you know, training one side and then it defects to another and backfires. Were any lessons learned?
I think the lesson that was learned from both Afghanistan and Iraq by the Americans, and it's not necessarily the right lesson, the Americans, the British and other allies, is don't get your boots on the ground. As I say, I don't think it's the right lesson, but I think they were badly burnt in both of those two campaigns, and that explains to a huge extent their reluctance to really commit to trying to deal with the Islamic State today in Iraq and in Syria.
Who's the greatest enemy today? Is it the Islamic State? Is it the Assad regime? And whose enemy are they?
For whom? It depends for whom.
Let's talk about for a moment what we've been, the United States and the UK, the Europe, this coalition that does exist still fighting them.
With your permission, first let's talk about the Syrian people.
Sure. One by one.
Yes, for them it's the same enemy. Yeah. And they say it all the time.
The Assad regime.
Yes, the Assad regime there's no difference between the Assad regime and the Islamic State. They do the same thing. They even use the same bombs. They slaughter their own peoples. That's what's going on right now in Syria. For Israel, for instance, I mean, we don't have the equivalent in Hebrew, but we used to say in Hebrew, we used to say in English, better the devil you know.
Right.
We know the devil. We know who Bashar al-Assad is. We don't know what's going to happen after Bashar al-Assad. But still, we have more and more indications that Bashar al-Assad is still using his forces not only inside Syria. If he eventually feel that his life is in danger, he will use everything he can in order to attack Israel, for instance. So there is no difference between Assad and the others.
In the little time we have left, I just want to direct one final question at you, Colonel Kemp. In the history, looking at interventionism in Afghanistan and Iraq, from your vast experience there, is interventionism, American, foreign interventionism, whoever it may be, a good idea in the Middle East?
I think we have no choice. And because, of course, what's happening in the Middle East doesn't just affect the Middle East.
Right.
Obviously, Israel is a major ally of the West, of America, of Britain, and we are interested in the effect on Israel of what's happening in places like Syria and Iraq. We're also interested in the fact that Westerners from Europe are going into Syria, being trained, blooded, experienced and directed to come back and attack at home. So we can't just let that happen. Plus, we cannot allow the place to develop into a safe haven to an extent it is already.
It's all about interests. Gentlemen, thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. Thanks for being with me. And we're going out for 2 minutes and we'll be back with One-on-One. Stay with us.